Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the closing panel of our conference this afternoon, which has been sponsored by MPS, who are also sponsoring the member-only drinks reception that will occur a little bit later on. It's a very, very great pleasure to welcome 5 very distinguished members of our community. They are from left to right on the panel. Brian Crawford, President of ACS Publishing, Tracy Armstrong, CEO of CCC, Ron Mobed, CEO of Elsevier, Steve Hall, Managing Director of IOPP, and Philip Carpenter, the EVP Research of Wiley. And they have graciously agreed to answer questions which you put to them during the registration process. I think you may recall we asked all of you to submit questions, and we've collated those together so that they form a common theme. And let's kick off first with Brian, and then others perhaps would like to comment on what Brian says, or have their own opinion, of course. Question number 1 is, what can publishers do to create genuine competitive advantage, in your opinions?
Thank you, Tracy. First comment I would make is that enabling technologies, as one of my former colleagues said, create an opportunity for a rising tide that lifts all boats. So one of the things I think we need to focus on is continuing that spirit of collaboration on enabling technologies. I think that we can then build on that for true competitive advantage. And a traditional way, of course, is the recruitment of the very best authors to publish. That's where each of us can exert creativity in the manner in which we market and conduct our outreach. I think technology has largely become a level playing field for us, but at the same time, the platform providers that each of us chooses to work with for the delivery of our content can provide a competitive advantage. And the manner in which we offer a combination of author services and customer-facing products is also, of course, a competitive advantage for us. Author services, I think, increasingly will be something that will distinguish us one from another in the sense of what we can afford to provide and what our policies encourage us to provide for authors.
Thank you, Brian. Tracy?
Well, I think if you were in the room for the last presentation, which was pretty fantastic, focusing on the user experience is really, I think, the best way to create a competitive advantage for publishers. And what's happening now, I think, is in the kind of clunky type of example that was just demonstrated in the last presentation, in that it creates an opportunity for other vendors, alternative routes to the content, maybe illicit. There are a lot of opportunities and gaps that are then being filled by other vendors, and the publisher doesn't have control of that flow. So I think the number one thing I would say is focusing on the user experience.
Ron?
So I was wondering how to answer this question, and I think probably the most effective way I can answer it is, why should I tell you? Unfortunately, I'm probably going to give you a somewhat trite answer. Competitive advantage really stems from being able to offer more value than the nearest alternative. And in our sector, I think it can come from technology, it can come from content, it can come from user experience, it can come from service quality, it can definitely come from not screwing up as much as the other guys. But I don't think there's one answer. It's simply constantly looking for where the differential value between you and the alternatives that your customer has can be sourced, and it may change from year to year. I would expect it to be. I don't think scale confers much of a competitive advantage. It's possible, in my opinion, that technology can, but I would be looking to all the different places that you can exploit compared to the nearest alternative.
Brian started by saying, find the best authors. I'd start even further up the chain and say, employ the best people you can. But I think we're going to talk about talent a bit later, so I'll come back to that. I'd actually disagree with Ron that scale doesn't make a difference. I think there's a world of difference between the way that a very large publisher can gain competitive advantage and one the size of IOP. And for us, it comes down to being discipline specific. What it means for us is that we need to have a really, really clear focus on the markets and the communities that we publish for. If we don't have that, we will not compete.
So I think we should start by recognizing that much of what we do is in fact commoditized and isn't a source of competitive advantage. So most of the publishers in this room would probably do their content processing in Mumbai or Chennai or somewhere in Manila. Many publishers in this room would use the same technology platforms provided by Atipon or Highwire or whatever. So much of that's standardized and to a significant extent commoditized. So the question then is, where do you look for advantage? And I agree. I think we have to look for advantage and differentiation in the customer experience. A few weeks ago, one of my colleagues said to me a very interesting thing. He said, if you think about the airline industry, airlines all use the same infrastructure. So they use Heathrow Airport, they use Kennedy. They also use the same airplanes, those kind of rather crapped out 747s that are so old you begin to wonder if they're going to fall out of the sky. And sometimes newer planes like A380s. So all the airlines use the same kit, but the experience of using those airlines is fundamentally different. I, for example, passionately hate British Airways. I spend large portions of my time telling people how much I hate British Airways, despite the fact that actually, under the skin, they're no different from Virgin. But I passionately prefer Virgin because my experience at check-in, my experience at the lounge, my experience on the plane is just better. So I think that analogy is helpful. Many of us use the same infrastructure, the same systems, the same vendors, the same kind of most things. But let's look at the experience we're giving our author, the researcher, the society client. Let's think about the customer and what it feels like to work with us.
Thank you very much. And I should emphasise that, in fact, neither BA nor Virgin are sponsors of this meeting. We had quite a lot of questions that I'm going to try and put together into one relatively succinct one on green open access. And this particular question is, firstly, where do we think we are on green open access? And perhaps in more detail, assuming that 12-month embargoes are in effect and have become the norm in STM publishing. In other words, most articles or the author final manuscript are publicly available 12 months after publication. What do you think will be the effect on your businesses? And do you see your current revenue from subscriptions being replaced by author charges? I think possibly we should start again with Brian on this one.
Afraid you would begin with me on that one too. Well, first, just to mention, we've made a shift in our adaptation to green open access in recent years. We previously deposited on behalf of authors into NIH's PubMed Central Repository. The work was funded by NIH. And recently, as we've introduced a range of options for open access for our authors, we've stopped making those deposits for the so-called author manuscript version. We make those deposits only for what would often be called gold versions, in other words, the paid version that we call our author choice. So one of the reasons that we did that is we recognized that we were just aiding the creation of an alternative repository and one that would potentially disseminate not the version of record which the scholarly community needs to rely on in perpetuity, but instead a less valuable version. We thought that was not in keeping with our mission, number one. Second, I think one of the major developments in our industry in the last year or so has been Chorus and the alternative of emphasizing to agencies that they should link to the publisher for the access to content that funding agency has provided. And again, this gives us the opportunity to emphasize to our authors the delivery of the version of record. And I say both of those things because I think that the so-called green open access movement does risk putting any of our publishing operations in peril because it provides an alternative source for information that the community could rely on in lieu of the version of record.
Thanks, Brian. Tracy.
Well, I'm in a little bit of a unique position up here, as I'm not a publisher, which I think everyone in the room probably knows. So I guess I'll talk about our position on kind of in the market here and what we're doing in relationship to open access. And really overall, what we're doing is trying to take friction out of the process. So my comment earlier on the user experience, here we are trying to help publishers and authors with that experience in the submission process through some products that we have created in the RightsLink family. And then also, just to echo Brian's comments on the version of record, through some of the workflow tools and software that we're selling, for example, into the corporate market, helping corporates understand when they're accessing something that is open, where they need to go for that, what's the best route to get there, and working with publishers on that. So I think as far as our role as a vendor in the market, what we're doing is really, I mean, we're embracing the open access movement for what it is. It's here, it's built to last. And we need to find ways to really, again, make the flow much easier for everybody involved. And that's really what CCC is doing.
I mean, the only supplementary I'd have there, particularly for you as an RRO, is that clearly people making requirements or restrictions on reuse rights will eat into secondary revenue, presumably.
Right. So RRO is an acronym for Reproduction Rights Organization, also known as Collective Management, and Copyright Clearance Center is a collective management organization and member of IFRO, which is also, the representatives are here. I think the CEO is here in the room of that international organization. And you're right, Michael, that there is a substantial secondary licensing stream that's generated on a significant amount of content in this room, and that's very different for green in particular. And I think what I would say about Copyright Clearance Center is, while we are a collective management organization, we're sort of, you know that phrase, we're not your father's blah, blah, blah. Well, we're not that. So we are really a hybrid organization that's doing a lot of software, tools, technology that we wrap our services in, and that increases the stickiness of the licenses that we sell on your behalf. Now, of course, that's not going to happen in the case of green. But it is what we're doing in the open access space, and where this factor does exist in the market, and you're really not going to get any licensing out of this green OA material. What we're doing is creating tools to help you and your customer, probably your most important customer, your author, have a better experience in that whole submission process, et cetera. So color charges, page charges, and APCs, for example.
Thank you. Ron?
Well, obviously, green open access depends completely on there being a sustainable subscription model on which to base the embargo period off. And to the extent that the 12-month period becomes a standard, the likelihood is that there will be some publications which are not sustainable at 12 months and some which are. And I think we'll go through a period of discovery where we see which are the publications that are completely viable at this period and which are not. I think the research community will probably regret, I don't mean you will live to regret, but will be unhappy if they see journals collapsing through lack of sustainability, and there will be some kind of counter mechanism over time. During this transition, some journals will be under pressure, some will prove that the 12-month period is completely sustainable, and organizations that are producing these journals will live through that, but at the same time will also be put on notice to make sure that whatever they do continues to deliver value to researchers.
When I was on the Finch working group in the UK in 2011, I argued very strongly for gold open access over green in the belief that in the long run it would be more sustainable for publishers. But I argued for that partly because some of the funders on the Finch Working Party had a starting position that they wanted green OA and they wanted no embargo or a very short embargo indeed. And it seemed to me and the other publishers on that group that a gold approach would be better for us, more sustainable in the longer term. I think it's quite possible that sorry, let me just come back. At the end of that process, some in the UK felt the UK had a gold model that the rest of the world would inevitably follow. We haven't seen that happen, and I think it's quite likely with reductions in science funding that we'll see in the UK next year, there will be some stepping back, even from the UK's current pro-gold position, the pro-gold position of the research councils. Our universities are pro-green, and if you look around most of the rest of the world, it's green. The US is very strongly green, China appears to be heading that way, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me we are inevitably going to be dealing primarily with green open access over gold. Gold will play a role, but it won't be as large a role as we might have expected it to be. How do we make that work? I think in general we can make it work with 12-month embargoes. I can speak mainly for my discipline again there of physics. It would be very different probably in some areas of the humanities and social sciences. But I think we can make it work. And I think we can make it work because there is a kind of huge compromise here between the publishers and the funders and those seeking that green open access. They know they cannot make green work without the support of the funders, whether it's through a solution like Chorus in the US or other solutions in other parts of the world where I think we have far less chance of making models like Chorus work. And I think many have come to recognize that we need that collaboration between the publishers and the funders and the institutions to make green work in a way that is sustainable for everyone. And as Ron said, there'll be some amendments, there'll be some changes to the way we make it operate. There may be changes in the periods of embargoes and so on that enable us all to continue to sustain the publishing system.
So my impression is that there is a kind of pervasive belief in our community that a 12-month embargo period is basically fine, it's livable with. I hear what Ron says about there will be some casualties and some will be fine. And I guess I bought that view, and have bought that view for some time now. But I sent an email to a colleague a couple of months ago and said, just out of interest, how much of our usage happens in the first 12 months? And I got an answer back, which frankly shocked me. Reid Elfenbein in the room will probably shoot me for saying this. But on the basis that there aren't too many librarians in the room, the number was less than 20%, which, gosh, that shocked me. I thought that the overall figure for Wiley would be significantly higher, given that clearly we have a preponderance of scientific and medical content on our site. So it makes you think, well, gosh, if it's only 20% in the first year, then surely at the margin we're going to see a lot of librarians deciding to buy in different ways. But then this morning I had an interesting conversation with Dan Culp sitting down there about his experience in high energy physics, where for one of his journals, the content is pervasively available prior to publication. And you say, well, okay, what's the effect of that? And Dan's comment was that if I get this right, was that the usage of that journal, parallel compared to its peer group, was 1/3 of the others, but the subscriptions were the same. That's an interesting little test case. You then have to dig a bit further and say, well, okay, what lies behind that? What lies behind that is where irrational economic behavior on the part of the librarian is a kind of belief system that we should have this content, that we should physically own it, as it were. Business model issues, like the fact that the high energy physics journal is bundled with other physics journals that mean that actually you're not going to segregate it out, and so on and so forth. So it's very complicated, and I have to say, I think my honest answer to this question is I don't know. I feel rather confused about it. I thought I was happy with a 12-month position, and then I was one morning woken up rather rudely. But it's a complicated picture, and I think we all need to think hard about what factors actually influence librarians' purchasing decisions. I think we know not enough about that.
Do any of you have any comments on any of the others and what they've said?
Thanks, Michael, for that opportunity. I would echo what Philip just said, and at ACS I'll reveal that within the first year, the amount of our lifetime access is about 30%, and after 2 years, we still have about 50% of the usage value of our content remaining. And so another squeeze play I think that is going on is that as we allow green posting by authors on scientific collaboration networks, we need to be careful that that kind of activity isn't systematized. So one of the reports that we heard earlier today, for example, is that ResearchGate was amassing a tremendous amount of content. To the extent that that content is archival content, then we lose the hold on the library market that we have for our content that hasn't been mandated green. So I think we have two forms of green to talk about. One is mandated green through agencies and legislatures, and the other is what we allow in the way of author behavior, but becomes basically usurped sometimes by entities that take advantage of that author behavior.
Anyone else? Right, well, we'll move on then to another question. And I think possibly we'll start at the other end, just to ring the changes. So, Philip, if you don't mind. Are publishers turning into software companies, or should they, asks one of our questioners. And another one says, if that's the case, is it worth investing in traditional journals if the future source of profit is actually in solutions?
So in the old days, the job of a publisher, the job of an editor, was about accumulating content, which we then sold to libraries who felt they had to buy it because they had to buy it. Times clearly have moved on, and I don't think many in the room would define their jobs as we accumulate content and we sell it to librarians. I would like to think that our industry has moved on from that kind of product content orientated model, and clearly technology allows us to do things with content that we haven't been able to do in the past. And so the question for us is, how can we use content and use digital technologies to help our various customer groups do what they want to do? We had a rather stark example just before the tea break of how we could do a lot better helping researchers find the content that they want on whatever it was. I can't remember the name of the article. But we need to help students discover. We need to help students to learn. We need to help students to get better grades in the courses they take. We need society members to use our content to get professional accreditation. We need to help authors use technologies to write a better article, to get it noticed, and so on and so forth. So I think the question for us is, it's not an either or. It's not a question of saying, are we about content? Are we about software? Are we about, as we're technology, or are we about a product? I think the answer is we're about helping our various customers succeed in what they're trying to do, and helping them succeed because we have both the content and the technology that helps them fulfill their own individual ambitions.
Steve.
So let me take that first question first, as to whether we're turning into software companies or whether we should turn into software companies. I think what we're turning into, or have already become, is digital companies. We're software enabled, and every year we become more software enabled. When IOP launched its new books program in 2013, we built it from the ground up as a digital program. But that doesn't mean we don't need commissioning editors and editorial boards and reviewers and so on to ensure that we're publishing the right books for the right markets. It's a mix of digital and human. And on the issue of investing in traditional journals, I think I'd probably echo, if I heard it right, some of what Philip has said. I don't much like the word, but what we're doing is investing in content. It is worth investing in content. Whether the journal survives as a wrapper for that content is perhaps moot. It's been around for 350 years, as we know. We've all been to celebrations this year. But it's only been around in digital form for about 20 years. And it's changed very significantly in those 20 years. I couldn't sit here and say today that the journal, as that wrapper for content, will still be there in another 20 years. Though in my experience, most things survive longer than the futurists tell us they will. But whether we have that wrapper or not, there'll still be a need for publication of content, for making it discoverable, for making it accessible and usable, for curating it, and so on. The journal's done a great job of that, but it won't necessarily survive. But while there might be 25,000 or so scholarly journals, there will not be 25,000 or so solutions. It will be a very limited number of solutions.
So, Ron.
I'm not sure there's much more I can add. I think we all are likely to agree that either extreme is probably not the right answer, that we continue to think about content as the only source of value that comes from organizations like ours, but going to the other extreme where we devalue the importance of content to the point that we don't want it anymore is also not a viable choice. Our customers, our end users, are trying to make scientific discoveries, and we're helping them with providing them with the information they need to do that better and faster. And that today means combining content and technology in ever more effective ways. And I think that combination of some sort will continue.
Tracy.
Well, probably based on the investment that most companies in this room are making in technology, you feel like software companies. That would be my first comment. And I think, coming from Copyright Clearance Center, which has been a vendor to this industry since the late 1970s, and I've been with the firm for now 25 years. So going back to, Steve, as you said, the 20 year ago when things were becoming digital, I've experienced sort of a similar journey in a much smaller company of transitioning a legacy business to something where you need to use technology and create software as a service models and use service plays that involve a huge investment in technology to keep your customer and build a platform, build an ecosystem that makes sense. So I think there's probably a lot going on here in your firms where there's not just the investment in the UI and the access and authentication and all of the things that we just saw in that stark example before the break on the user trying to access content. But in addition to that, there's a huge investment in your back-end operating systems because they probably were built in stovepipes, societies were brought in, these authors are used to kind of this manuscript submission process, and these over here are used to that, and we don't want to disrupt anything for these people. When you first transition a legacy business, you tend to basically take what exists and just digitize what exists, instead of sort of leapfrogging and actually building something that neutralizes the play. That's very common for kind of entrenched players. So that may be a scenario here. The other thing I would say is I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all answer for publishing. Are all publishers in the same place in terms of their investment in technology? No. And some publishers are already kind of infomediaries. They're in that middle space. And what you can see happening in the market is really substantial gaps are starting to build between sort of the haves and the have-nots in terms of the firms who can really put it out there on the technical side. And I think those ecosystems, you can see from a vendor's perspective, just keep acknowledging my role here and our role. You can see that there's sort of friendly fire going on, but there's also sort of, other enemies looming large. And we need to make sure as an industry, everyone who is invested, even not just intellectually, but emotionally invested in what the journal represents and all of the history in this industry, which is very near and dear, I think, to everyone here, that we are also focused on kind of what's out there. And, the friendly fire distracts us from that. So I think those are a few comments that just occurred to me as you were making yours.
Thank you, Brian.
I agree with Philip that mostly what we do is stitch together software to be able to offer services to our authors, to our customers, librarians, and individuals alike. So we're not software companies per se, and most of us are not writing code. We're usually stitching that together. I would say we're more database providers. As journal publishers, we've evolved to be connected databases, serving up primarily PDF files to a large group of users around the world who seek to consume information in that format. Of course, we offer other formats and other linking to other types of information databases, but primarily we're delivering PDF documents around the world. I'm going to quote a former boss of mine, Eric Swanson, known to many of you here in STM circles, about what one would look at for in the way of new journals. Eric said something to me one time that I wrote down on a napkin, so I've now committed it to memory. It was, journals are clubs, the purpose of which is to keep some people out in the rain, and that the motivation for that, to accept some while excluding others, falls right behind the quest for food, shelter, and sex in motivating sentient creatures. That's the quote. The point behind that, though, is that the filtering mechanism that we provide, where we place the velvet rope, I think is something that we've evolved from as journal publishers. Now we're accepting more across the board. There are different models, such as the model of publishing work not necessarily of significance, but work that is scientifically valid and might move the field forward. I think what we need to evaluate as publishers is, to what extent do we emphasize the filtering role, and to what extent do we emphasize the communications role when starting a journal. I still think there's tremendous value in following where science evolves and offering both the filtering and the communication roles.
Thank you very much. Clearly they had bigger napkins in those days. The next question is one I think of as the Father Christmas question, because it's essentially some fairy godmother is going to come to you and say, yes, Mr. CEO, you can increase the headcount of your organisation by 5%. Where would you allocate those extra people and why? And perhaps, Brian, we can start your end this time.
Well, our journal publishing operation is about 300 people, so we would be talking about 15 heads to be added to our journal publishing. We look across all of ACS, we're close to 2,000 employees, so you can do the math and see that we'd be adding additional people if we were talking about that scale. I would actually add in non-traditional roles, not what we call editorial or sales or marketing. I think we would add in more in business development and in market development, particularly in developing countries. I would also look at adding individuals who can engage at a high level with university administrators, those who are involved, the heads of R&D operations, involved in making decisions about what information their organizations need to access, and also what their organization's policies are with respect to supporting, for example, open access. We have traditional sales staff, of course, making sales calls on librarians. I think over time we need to have individuals capable of handling a more complex discussion with administrators about how we can ourselves embed ourselves within their own programs and needs.
Thank you. Tracy?
Well, to make the impact the fastest, I would add in the technology group, and in specific, one of the groups that we're working on building out is data engineering, and that so that would kind of get the train rolling with some of my spending, and then to the point that you made, Brian, what I would call strategic account management, I would add there as well, and for us, that would be a lot of work with the major academic accounts and the major corporate accounts that are actually using the services that we're selling. So those would be the two big areas.
Thanks. Ron?
Let me answer the question in two parts. First, I think if you're talking about 5% net, then I'd be thinking about, at the same time as adding people, taking some people away. As our operations continue to improve in terms of productivity, we should be able to do the same with less or more with the same. So I'd expect continuous reduction in some of the production-oriented activities, and that would allow a gross add of more than 5% in areas where I think I would characterize the need as one of speciality and expertise. So I'm not pointing particularly at technology or content or open access or sales or marketing. I'm saying in all of those functions, the need is for very high-end expertise, the best of the best, possibly coming from outside of our sector, in order to have the skills in those individual functions to be as high quality as possible.
Thanks. Steve?
I don't know whether to be pleased or embarrassed to say this, but in the 5 years I've been at IOP, we have grown our headcount by about 4% per year. So I can speak from experience rather than from theory. If I look at where we've added those people, they've been very largely in sales and marketing and editorial roles, partly driven by launching a new books program a couple of years ago, partly driven by winning new partner journals and so on. But the real growth I would look at geographically rather than by function, and the real growth has come in Asia. So we have twice the number of people in China that we had 5 years ago, probably more than twice the number of people that we had in China. And we have people in 5 countries where we didn't have people at all 5 years ago. And I think that's where we're likely to continue to grow.
Philip?
This is a dangerous question because I have colleagues sitting in the audience who will write down and hold against me anything I say at this point, given we're about to start budgeting. I mean, the answer will vary according to the needs of individual businesses, where they think they see the greatest opportunities, where they think they'll get the greatest return. And of course, you wouldn't spend all the money, as it were, in one place. And as Ron says, you'd be looking to take some money away from some areas and put them into others. But just to go back to a couple of things I said earlier, one is, wherein might lie competitive differentiation? And secondly, what is it that we're actually trying to do? So if we say that differentiation may lie around customer experience, and if we say what we're really trying to do is to help our customers fulfill their ambitions, achieve at what they're trying to do, then that's probably where you're going to spend your money. Invest in people whose job it is to get under the skin of what it feels like to be a customer of Wiley or of whoever, and figure out what solutions we can create for them. So I think that will be one area. I think the other area is around communication. I think as an industry we are simply terrible at it. To give an example, we had a fascinating presentation on Research for Life earlier today. I suspect that much of that presentation was news to a lot of us, despite the fact that Research for Life has to be arguably the best thing this industry has done in the last 20 years. So I would say getting better about explaining ourselves, getting better about explaining the value we add to the research communication process, getting better actually at explaining to our staff, our colleagues, what we want them to do, what we are trying to do. All those things I feel are sorely under-resourced in our industry, and I think that's where some of the money should go.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, a related question that we got was to do with, I suppose, other HR matters. And this one was, how do panellists attract, retain and motivate top-class talent at a time of intense competition? And perhaps, Philip, we could start at your end and go back the other way.
Well, just coincidentally, maybe not coincidentally, yesterday I got an email. Once a week, our colleagues in Wiley's learning and development function send us a little video, a 5-minute video about some topic in leadership and management. And this week's 5-minute video was precisely about this question. How does an organization retain high potential employees? And it was a talking head of a researcher at, I'm not entirely sure the university, but she'd done some work on why high flyers stayed for long periods with companies. And the question was, is it because they're given challenging assignments, really interesting stuff to get their teeth into? Maybe. Is it about things like mentoring schemes, coaching schemes, specific learning projects and commitments? And her finding, which let's assume it's right, her finding was powerfully that the thing that motivates very talented colleagues to stay is that they feel their employer is making a specific investment in them individually, that they are providing the advice, the guidance, the support, the teaching, the coaching, and if necessary, the formal education that will help them progress. And she argued, therefore, that there was a kind of reciprocal bond. In other words, if you invest in me, I'll invest in you. I'll commit to you. I could go on. I think we could answer this question at enormous length and talk about every aspect of recruitment, of career pathways, of learning and development. But I guess we can't go on forever. So I think the only thing I'd add is that, beside that specific commitment to investing in individuals, clearly all our colleagues, indeed all of us, want jobs in which we feel we're doing something worthwhile, that we're doing something valuable, and also we want jobs in which we feel valued, listened to, appreciated, congratulated for doing stuff well. So I could go on forever, but I'll stop at that point.
Okay. Steve?
Well, I'd agree with Philip about all the stuff about developing people and making them want to stay with you. But more generally, I think there's a dearth of top-class talent in the industry. Now, obviously, I'd exclude my fellow panelists from that description, all of you in the room. You're all the exceptions. But I think scholarly publishing is less entrepreneurial, more risk-averse, more formulaic than it used to be. That might have something to do with the fact that there are far fewer small publishers around. And if you're a small publisher, you rely a lot more on ingenuity and innovation and a willingness to take risks. And at the end of the day, we're a rather small and somewhat incestuous industry. You know, those 6 degrees of separation don't exist in our industry. It's 2 at most, and probably frequently 1. So it's rather small. I think it's become very conservative. I think part of the reason it's become conservative is because of these extraordinary external political pressures that have been on us for the last 10 years. As a result, we spend much of our time in a kind of defensive posture. So I think we're all fishing for that talent in the same rather small pool. And I think leaving aside the kind of financial considerations, I think attracting and retaining the right talent comes down to having the right kind of vision and mission and set of values for your business, and a culture in which you encourage some risk, you give your colleagues some room to breathe, and encourage fresh thinking. And I'm quite sure that all my senior colleagues in the room here will tell you later over a beer that I do absolutely none of that.
Ron?
So obviously we're a big publisher, and we spend quite a lot of time trying very hard to stamp out entrepreneurialism, creativity, and innovation. And therefore we find it very difficult to attract people from the competitive pool that Steve was just describing. Therefore, we look outside. And there we find actually we have quite a pleasant experience. And I think one of the big reasons we find that we are able to attract talent from outside of our sector is the attraction of working in a sector that has such a clear purpose, the purpose being to advance science. We don't spend our time trying to figure out a more convenient way to send a photograph of your ice cream to your sister. We spend our time trying to help science progress, and this seems to be a tremendous motivator to many of the people who come to work for us. I think it's a great advantage.
Tracy?
So just building on that a little bit, the first thing I would say is, giving people something that's intellectually stimulating to work on. I think that's a great motivator. I had read an article many years ago before I was CEO at this company talking about one of the things that can really bring somebody down at work. And you think, well, maybe it's the boss, it's really not the nicest person, or the office environment, or the space I sit in is too small or not enough light. It's not those things, it's actually the coworkers. So the kind of the intellectual heft of the coworkers, and feeling that sense of we're kind of all in this together. I'm not the A student kind of dragging along the C- student, that actually brings people down. So I think having a good even force of people who are operating at the same level is really important. I think looking outside of your space is really important, because infusing your collaborators with new ideas that you're bringing in from the outside. The other thing I think is very important for retention is everybody on the team getting as close as they can to the purpose or mission of what you're out to accomplish. So getting your people as close as you can to the core of your strategy, having them be involved in formulating it, or in its formulation, having them be involved in implementing it and understanding how what they're doing is tying back to that. Now, I work at a company with about 350 employees, so that's a lot different than some of my colleagues up here. But at any size, it's a challenge. And sometimes the tablet from the mount approach is easier, and the meeting is more efficient, but the process can be still efficient and inclusive in appropriate ways. And I think that is a big key to retention. And it helps people feel that they're really more tied to the core mission of the firm, and they stick around, especially if it's, again, very stimulating and the problems that they're trying to solve, have a lot of weight.
Thanks. Brian?
In our case, as a professional society, we benefit from the fact that many individuals who are drawn to us want to serve, in our case, chemistry. So they feel aligned with our society's vision and mission, and our publishing tracks with that, because that's the way in which scientists communicate. I think another dimension, though, to comment on is diversity. And so stressing gender, ethnic diversity within our operations, but also diversity of personality types. I believe strongly in assembling teams of individuals whose traits complement one another, not a group of robots. And of course, scientists can sometimes be portrayed as one-dimensional. So I think a diversity of personality types added to the gender and ethnic diversity provides for retention. We've been fortunate also in that advocates within our operation help us to recruit in contacts from within their professional environment over time. That kind of natural networking helps us tremendously. And just to comment on one aspect of the trait of a scientist, some scientists are, of course, those who engage in what I call lab exercises. They will repeat the same process over and over again, whereas others are more creative types, and they are, kind of the out there experimentalists. And we need a mixture of the two within publishing. One might typecast certain functions as being repetitive, whereas other areas, for example, new product development, require that kind of creative flair.
Thank you very much. We now have a rather quick-fire question for you all. And this question is, what startup or new entrant most impressed you this year and why? And I'm not going to do this in turn. I just want those of you to jump in as you have a view on this.
Shall I go?
Yeah, wherever.
I don't know if this answer is allowed, and maybe this answer is motivated by the fact that at the end of the day we're going to get a free drink from these people. But I think the answer is Chorus. I think it's in our midst. We're looking at an organisation which has done some pretty remarkable things in a short period of time. It's engaged the publisher community pretty comprehensively, got us on board. It's engaged the funder community and got a lot of the funders on board. Not all of them, but we're never going to win all those battles. It's developed a technology that works, and developed a technology that works quickly and on budget. And how often does that happen? So I take my hat off to the Chorus guys, and I, for one, maybe don't have time for this argument. I am an advocate of the idea that Chorus is something we should explore outside the US. And maybe we can discuss that another time.
I should remind people that you get drinks from us first before you get drinks from Chorus. So, Steve.
I'm not the person to ask about tech startups. Every investment I've made in tech startups personally has failed. So don't take any tips from me. So I'm much more of an empiricist now. I like to see how a company's doing before I back it. And frankly, my answer is on a par with Philip's. The people I'd go back to time and again are Crossref, who have been around for going on for 20 years now, but just keep coming up with good ideas and executing them really well. and ideas that really serve the whole scholarly communications chain. So it didn't really answer the question.
So we've got chorus and crossref. Ron?
I'm going to give you a bit more of a generic answer. I think there's some really interesting work going on at the moment with startups who are engaged in the whole area of analytics. And some of them are very dedicated to our sector, some of them are much more horizontal. And I'm generally impressed by the work that they're doing.
Tracy?
Well, I think access and authentication is a very challenging area, and one of the companies that we are actually working with, they're not this year, but they're very recent, is Okta, and they're working with the SAML standard. I think that's a very interesting company that is one to watch.
Well, I cast my vote also in favor of Chorus and its collaboration with Crossref and success in collaborating with publishers and external parties. There are two smaller areas of innovation I want to mention. One is in the area of my colleague right to my left, and that is the Copyright Clearance Center has helped us tremendously as we have offered a broader range of open access options. And rather than creating the e-commerce behind that ourselves, we were successful in collaborating with CCC on that. And the other is Highwire Press offers a new service called Impact Visor. If you've not seen it already, I think it bears having a look because, as Ron just said, some of the analytics that are being developed out there are very important. And in that case, Impact Visor has helped us to look closely at the editorial performance of our portfolio. So I would mention both of those.
Great, thank you. We'll move on then to another staff-related question, really. How can we encourage greater diversity in the academic publishing industry? And the questioner it particularly wants you to think in terms of race, ethnicity, and class background, and I presume also gender. So I don't know who wants to kick off on that.
I'll go. Yes to all those dimensions. I think geography is another one. Wiley is an international company, but it's headquartered in the US, and a lot of senior positions are held by people either in the US or the UK. And clearly that doesn't map onto, as it were, the geographic diversity of our organisation. So I think in answer to the question, clearly you have to start with, at the beginning, with recruitment. Then I think we need to develop, as it were, structures and processes that allow people to develop their careers, to build their skills, to move on to the next job in whatever part of our organisation or someone else's organisation. So we need to create the structures which allows all talent to flourish, irrespective of gender, race, geography, whatever it might happen to be. So I think it's in the structure and the processes that I think the answer probably lies.
Steve?
I think almost any answer sounds trite here. I work in a discipline which is in physics, which is very male-dominated. And my parent institution, the Institute of Physics, has a very, very strong commitment to gender equality and to encouraging more women to be active in physics and so on and so forth, supporting them in any way it can. We try to mirror that in the business itself. You can have the best intentions, you can have good processes, you can have good rules, but this is not something that you can change quickly.
Ron?
So I'm going to touch on two areas, gender and ethnicity. And I'm going to separate them because our findings in the company are actually different between the two. Across the company, our gender mix is more or less 50-50. But in common with many organizations, the number of women in senior positions in the organization takes an enormous dip at around about the level, let's say, 2 away from my position. And it's been like that for quite some time. So we've actually spent quite a lot of time on the gender side trying to figure out how to improve that one specific dimension of our mix in gender. And the efforts on this have long predated me, but have not really met with very much success. So we're trying a slightly different tack now, where we've brought in an outside organization essentially to look at us and benchmark us compared to other organizations, and then help us with recommendations to try something different which works this time. So that's gender. On ethnicity, the problem goes back a little bit further. Even our lower and entry-level positions tend to have a mix which does not have very much ethnic diversity compared to the populations in which we're working. And there we have a different issue, which I think we'll have to address differently. We've decided to attack the gender problem at senior levels first, and then to move from there to ethnicity. But right now, that's the way we're looking at it.
Thank you, Tracy.
Okay, well, I'll take the gender thing separate, just so I don't go on too long about it. It's just a risk. So on the first thing I wanted to comment on is just the globalization of the firm. So when I took the post that I'm in now in 2007, we were really very American. Everybody was American, essentially. Maybe missing something in my memory. And I actually had a great conversation right around that time with YSG, who gave me some counsel on this very generously. And I really thought about what he had to say, and he said, he gave me this advice. I won't go into a lot of detail about it, but he said, this is going to take you about 7 to 10 years if you do it right. And he was right. It's taken a long time, but to diversify the teams so that we can work with our global clients and really show a global face. And in so many ways, that had to change, from our board to our executive team, really across the board. We have similar challenges to everything else that's been discussed up here from a diversity perspective. On the gender piece, so I mentioned that I've been at this company for 25 years, which is pretty rare. I started as a clerk. I had a liberal arts degree, and so, in the 80s, female, you have a liberal arts undergraduate degree. I wasn't in hard sciences. The first thing you usually did at a job interview was you were offered either a typing test, or if it was a really bad day, they also offered you a spelling test. I'm sure that some of my colleagues in the room can relate to this on one half of the table, but you don't have to raise your hands. I won't embarrass you. There are also people like Karen Hunter, who went before me, who had to make some really hard choices. As far as I know, she never owned revenue and didn't have an opportunity to. And when I was ascending into this position, I got some unbelievable advice from her. And it was women like her that went before me that enabled me to have this position. And I think particularly in the sciences, because there are so few women in senior positions, the women that are there or are kind of circling around a level or two below are unbelievably insightful, kind of for the next generation of people like me who actually, I have 3 kids and I'm doing this job. And I had a 3-year-old my youngest kid was 3 when I took this job. So that has, I could write a book about that. Within my company, I think, and I sometimes get asked, I do a lot of mentoring, coaching, talking to women, young women who say, talk about balance all the time, all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. Love to talk more about that if anybody wants to, but I won't do it now. But the one thing I'll say is I often get asked, well, who are the mentors? Who are, how did you figure this path out? And every day, I would say it's the women that are working around me. So you can learn a lot in your organization if you're trying to diversify from the women that are down below the ceiling. Because what they're going through every day to get their job done is something very, very different than what's happening above the ceiling. And I'm learning from them too. Because gender neutral, when you surpass that ceiling, it's just a different world. And even in the same gender, you have to really go back and get grounded to what it's like to be responsible for throwing the kid with the neighbor at 7 a.m. so you can get to get on the call by 7:15, even though school doesn't start until 8:15. And none of us would be here if somebody didn't do that. So and it just changes the dynamics of the firm. So at my executive team, I don't know if I'm 50-50, but I'm pretty close. There's a lot of women at the table. So, I think a key is to get women owning revenue. I was the second woman in the history of the company to ever own revenue. And the first one who went before me didn't have as many choices as I did. It's a generational issue. So there's so much I could say on this topic. Just look around, look at the panel. This is kind of where we are.
Michael, I'm not even going to try to comment after that.
The only thing I will say is that when I took this job over nearly 10 years ago, a leader of one of our learned societies said to me, "Oh, them, you're working for them. Isn't this a bunch of middle-aged, grey-haired men giving each other ties?" Well, we put a stop to that, and I know that in recent years we've been trying very hard as an organisation to ensure that there is a balance of speakers at all our meetings. And the last time we did an analysis, which I think was last year, it was 50-50 male and female. But that doesn't mean, as Tracy says, that there isn't a lot more work to be done. So thank you all for that. We're getting very close to the end here, so I want to really ask perhaps a more personal question, which you may or may not feel comfortable answering this, but I'll ask it anyway. And what motivates you? What gets you up in the morning? What makes you want to continue doing the job that you're doing? And I'm not going to ask anybody to go first. I'm looking to see if any of you want to offer up a view on this.
I'll go. First, the thrill of the chase. Going after a new product, new service that serves our audience. I truly love the thrill of the chase. And second, but it's really not behind it, it's really parallel, is the ability to go into work each day and know you're working with a team of colleagues who are committed to excellence. It's really a matter of commitment to excellence. And I think so many of us across this industry share that commitment to excellence.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yep, okay. I think for me, personally, really personally, it's not about achieving numbers. I'll get shot if my boss heard that. It's about creating a community that thrives and succeeds, a community where people can fulfill their potential. I think that's fundamentally rewarding. And yeah, that's what gets me going.
Any of the others want to offer?
So I'm an engineer by training, and turns out I quite like building things. And the motivation for me in this role is I get to build things. And I mentioned earlier the sense of purpose in the sector that we're in. Building something which is actually worthwhile is a lot better than building something which has relatively little utility. So a combination of being given the opportunity to build and build something that has purpose actually turns out to be quite a motivating combination.
Tracy?
Well, for me, it's change. I really am into frequent change. I'm not stuck in one place in this role. And at CCC, as long as I have been there, I've still been able to really diversify the portfolio and work on different problems. So from a personal level, that's a big piece that motivates me. So I'm working with a great team. And like I commented before, it's the people you work with and how intellectually stimulating that is, the problems in front of you, and also I love interfacing with the client. So, and learning more about their business and finding the space between that where we can solve problems. So that always brings, a diverse portfolio, new things we can be working on. I'm very competitive, so I like the kill myself.
That really is, I think, getting us towards the end of this afternoon. But oh, sorry, Steve. Yes, of course.
I've been in this industry nearly 40 years now, and I think I'd echo what Tracy said. It's the constant change. I remember joining Chadwick Healy in 1988, it being a company of 32 people at that point. I was the 32nd, and there was one computer in the building which sat on the finance director's desk. Obviously it wasn't a PC, because the PC at that point had not been invented. And certainly in that business over the next 10, 12 years, we went on an quite extraordinary roller coaster ride as we moved from being a microform and reprint publisher to CD-ROM to online databases and using the internet. And it's really never stopped since. Those were kind of technical and business model challenges. We've moved on since then, and certainly something I've focused on quite a lot over the last 7 or 8 years is the fact that those technical developments have potentially in some ways allowed us to be disintermediated or created the possibility of disintermediation. So while there's still a business model issue, there's a political issue as well. So I think it's been an extraordinary time to work in this industry, an industry I love because it's serving the good. There are times, of course, when one thinks, gosh, wouldn't it just be great if it all stood still for a year or two? But of course it never does. So it's that excitement of constant change. And the other thing that gets me going into work every day is my colleagues. I love working with them.
I think that's a fantastic way to draw this panel to a close. I hope you join with me in thanking our panelists for their honesty and participation.